Welcome to Pastoring on Purpose. I am Dr. Tim Mannis. I am the Pastoral Care / Spirit Care Coordinator here at Ministerial Care, and we are welcoming you into our studios here in Cleveland, Tennessee. And to my right is my colleague, Dr. Jeff Sargent. Say hello to all of our listeners out there, Dr. Sargent.
Thank you, Tim. It's good to be back in the studio and in this wonderful facility here, the Office of Ministerial Care, which is providing wonderful service for our ministers and their families. It's just a really beautiful place to visit. If you're in Cleveland, you should come by and take a look at the facility and get to know these people. They're wonderful people. And today I'm excited about our podcast as we talk about leadership. We've got an individual who has really been in a very unique leadership position. It's not the position, it's the situation and circumstances.
Yeah.
Now, we all think that our situation is unique, and it is to some extent, but this is really unique. And so I think our listeners are going to really enjoy hearing Dr. Walker's perspective.
Absolutely. I mean, how do you follow a legend? How long was Dr. Kahn there as the president?
34, yes.
34 years, and he was there when I was there. And, that's one thing, to follow after someone who has been there for so long and had the success that Dr. Kahn has had, and then have to do that before the pandemic actually was about to hit.
Yes.
And then you're going through that, not to mention everything else that's involved with that. Dr. Walker, first of all, let me just introduce our speaker today, our guest at the Ministerial Care office here today. We do have Dr. Mark Walker. Dr. Walker is the president of Lee University and former lead pastor of Mount Paran Church of God. And we are extremely excited to have you in the office today. We were actually sharing some of our McDonald's stories before we started recording. All three of us worked at McDonald's at one point.
We did.
Yeah, what does that say about us? we could probably spend a whole episode just talking about the analysis of that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Mannis. Thank you, Dr. Sargent. Happy to be with you. Appreciate the opportunity to talk about leadership. Anytime I can talk about leadership, I welcome the opportunity. So appreciate it very much.
Well, the topic today is leadership during challenging times. And I'll say this, because one of the first times I actually met you is when we did the pastoring in pandemic on Zoom. And I'll never forget this, Dr. Walker, because we were doing our rehearsal. We kind of getting to know the panel and everybody. And I think this was the first time you were on there, and you asked me, so you're the one moderating it? And I said, yes, I am. And I'm going to be quite honest with you right now. I had no idea what I was doing. I couldn't share it at the time. But that was the very first time that I did that. We had such a great success with that. We had thousands and thousands and thousands of views and comments. And I was just getting my feet wet back then that gave me the confidence really to do this podcast. And so that was the first time I met you, and I was shaking throughout that whole process.
Yeah, anytime you step into something new, right?
Yeah.
It's kind of sink or swim. We did a great job, as I recall.
It was great. I thought it went really well, and but I was really excited to be able to do that, and it really is exciting to have you with us today. As many of our listeners are currently serving as leaders and have led churches and currently leading churches and perhaps even other organizations outside of the Church of God, I doubt that any of them, or many of them, I should say, perhaps, have stepped into what is probably a more unique leadership situation than you, following, as I've already talked about, an iconic leader. And during the first year of your presidency, you had to deal with the pandemic, and the American culture is kind of in this the middle of a socio-political tug of war that places academic institutions, especially Christian universities, in the middle of it. Kind of share with our listeners today, how did you deal with that process? How difficult was it? Are you still going through it? What are some of the challenges you've had to kind of deal with? And, just kind of share with the listeners today about that.
Well, you just named a lot of the challenges I've had to deal with. The idea of following a transformational leader such as Dr. Kahn, in many respects, it's not the first time I've done that. Mm-hmm. Those of you may know my father, Dr. Paul Walker, a very successful transformational leader.
Right.
obviously in his own rights. And I followed him at Mount Perrin. I pastored Mount Perrin North Church. He got one of the locations of Mount Perrin North, of the Mount Perrin ministry, and did that for 25 years. And so it's not the first time I've had to do that. But, with following Dr. Kahn, one of the great things is that he and I had a very, very good relationship prior to me even coming to Lee. We've known each other for a good while. And so we had a good relationship coming in, a good understanding of what I was doing when I first came to Lee. And then when stepped into the presidency, and of course he's our chancellor, stayed on as chancellor, he has been a huge resource of help and encouragement. And we really worked very, very hard in the transition. We had about 6 months of transition. Interestingly enough, it was right in the middle of COVID, so it was an interesting kind of transition as he was transitioning to chancellor, I was transitioning to president. And we really worked very, very hard on establishing our roles and relationship. And he has done this so well with me. He doesn't overstep in terms of if he might feel like I'm maybe not making a right choice or going the right direction. He doesn't just stop right in there. He's told me, he said, I'm only going to weigh in if you want me to weigh in. Yeah. To which I have said, please weigh in, especially if I'm headed off a cliff. I want you to grab me. And yeah. So we've had a very good relationship in that regard. And again, the institutional knowledge that he has, obviously the leadership knowledge that he knows far more about Lee and its history and the Cleveland, so many parts of this. And so it's been a wonderful relationship, and I'm very grateful he is with us. And of course, I think when you follow a transformational, iconic leader, someone of high success, the number one thing is you got to be comfortable in your own skin. You have to know who you are. And realize you can't do it the way the other leader did it. Mm-hmm. Now, that doesn't mean you come in and just change everything the leader did. It doesn't mean you come in and just, no, you have to come in my opinion, you have to come in, you have to listen, you have to learn, you have to understand the culture in which you're coming into. Yeah. And there's going to be the comparisons, you just have to understand that. You can't let that scare you or make you angry or whatever. It's just going to happen. And that's where you have to really be secure in who you are. Wow. Secure in your leadership, secure in your identity in Christ, secure in all those things. Now, that doesn't mean insecurity is not going to creep in. Nobody's totally secure. All of us have insecurities. Sure. And so you have to be able to really feel comfortable there. And you have to be able to accept and stand there when the other person is getting all the accolades or whatever, and you have to accept that and be happy for them. And so we've worked very hard too, in really honoring the leadership of Dr. Kahn, as well as what I tried to do with my dad as well. That recognizing, I'm drinking out of wells I didn't dig. I'm eating out of gardens I didn't plant. I'm living in places I didn't build. You know what I'm saying? Yeah, and respecting that and honoring that and realizing and embracing that and being grateful. But if you take on the aspect of sense of jealousy or, boy, I'm going to outdo that, or I think you're setting yourself up really for just a lot of difficulty. And, the team that we have in terms of the cabinet team was a team that he had in place, high successful, high quality, high performing team. And boy, one of the things that was very helpful to me, which I'm very grateful for, is that team really worked hard at providing me the loyalty and really saying, hey, we're here to support you. And of course, Dr. Kahn's a part of that team as well. And boy, and I think it's something else too. You talked about the pandemic and you talked about coming into that. In some respects, it's really weird to sit here and say, the pandemic probably helped. I mean, that sounds kind of weird. You would say a pandemic was helpful. But in terms of coming in with the whole pandemic, everything was so different there was not a whole lot to compare previous leadership to current leadership because everything was so different, right?
Yeah.
No one had navigated what every leader had to navigate, regardless of what field they're in with this whole pandemic. So in some respects, it took the comparison game, kind of put it way back on the back burner.
That makes sense because there's not a playbook on it. It's not like you can just draw from this playbook or some other leader's already done this. It's fresh, it's new, and you're trying to kind of figure this out along with everyone else, right?
Right. And so then it also kind of set the pathway by which my leadership could emerge. In other words, just the uniqueness. Well, that's Mark Walker, or that's so in some respects, that was helpful. But yeah, I think the key thing really in following successful leadership is, boy, you really have to be secure in who you are. You really have to get an understanding of the landscape. And then this is where it can get a little tense or challenging too, is when you do feel like there needs to be change. And you got to change from perhaps where previous leadership was going. And so far in those instances, Dr. Kahn's been very, very good with that. And, sometimes you're forced to have to make change. That's where a leader can initiate change, or a leader has to respond to change. It's kind of two different things. And we've had a situation too, where we've had to do a lot of responding. We've had turnover, which is kind of natural in a leadership transition.
Right.
Yeah. My experience has been, and I think literature shows, that when you have a long-term, highly successful leader, when that leader transitions out, you can just expect other transition, which we've seen happen, and at some pretty high key positions. So we've had, in some respects, change forced on us. Obviously, the pandemic forced a lot of change, but I mean, just going even beyond just organizational type of decisions we've had to make, because we've had people to leave. And again, I think you can't be threatened by that.
Right.
As a leader, you need to recognize when you're stepping into a new place after a high successful leader, you're just going to have to expect that, and you can't take that personal. You have to keep the organization in mind. You've got to keep the vision and the mission in mind, and deal with it in that regard. Now, you want to have the conversation, and I'll shut up because I see you want to ask me a question or say something. I think you do, any kind of an exit interview, if you will, you do want to sit down with that individual and say, okay, help me understand why you're leaving, if there are some personal leadership things there or whatever, you can learn from that. But all in all, you can't take that personal. You have to recognize it's a reality. Okay, and then what's best for this person as they leave, and what's best for our organization as we look to have to replace or make changes.
This is so good because, know who you are. That seems to be a theme that we kind of go back to, isn't it, Jeff? That, be comfortable in your skin. Know who you are as a leader. Try not to be someone that you're not. And I get from that also is having realistic expectations. You mentioned there's going to have to be change. Do you recommend when someone's, because we see this quite often. If there's been a pastor, let's say, at a church for a long time, and we hear all these kind of horror stories of how the transition was difficult and tough. And it's really refreshing to me, Dr. Walker, to hear you say how smooth that was and how you was able to lean upon the board and other people and Dr. Kahn to help you through that transition. But is there a certain, is it just particular to the church that you're at or the leadership that you're at where you say, I'm going to wait a certain amount of time before I implement change? Is there a book on that?
Well,
per se.
Well, there are several books on organizational change. John Kotter is one of the premier.
Kotter.
Kotter. It's Kotter, I believe his last name is. He's done a lot on change. Sam Chand has written a lot on change. Dr. Sam Chand, if you know who he is, a lot on change. So, I mean, there's a lot of stuff out there about change. The one thing about change is no matter what it is, it's not always easy. Anytime there's change, there's going to be resistance. You have to deal with it. But to answer your direct question, I think depend on what the circumstances are, because you could have a situation where you're stepping into a sinking ship, and you don't have time to kind of walk around and make friends with everybody because you got this gaping hole in your hull and the ship is going down. You got to go find the materials to get that hole filled in so your ship stays afloat. So depending on that, if you're in that kind of a crisis, a leader has to step in and make quick decisions and do things quickly to just, to just keep the thing afloat, so then you can begin to start looking at other ways the thing needs to rise up and change. So yes, if you're walking into that kind of a situation, boy, a leader's got to really be ready to start making some quick actions to keep things going. If you're walking into a situation where things are pretty good, and it's decent, I think a leader there has to take time. Now you could have somebody rising up from the organization that totally understands the culture, has all the relationships, and maybe that person, if there are some quick changes needed, can begin that because they've got the credibility.
Yeah.
But if you're stepping in to an organization you didn't necessarily rise up in, I think you really have to take the time to build relationships and understand the culture. I think you got to be patient. You got to listen. You have to have conversations with all key people and just kind of see where everybody is and hear what everybody's thinking and saying, and so that you kind of can get a sense of, okay, here's where we are. Where do we need to go?
Yeah.
Because I think in those instances where everything's pretty much going decently, there can be room for improvement. There's always room for improvement.
Sure.
I mean, the best organizations have room for improvement.
Absolutely.
But I think it's in those settings where a leader can come in, and if he or she just wants to really just do stuff, and without really building the what am I looking for? Building into the account that I've earned this credibility to make this kind of change. I think that's where you run into a lot of issues.
Yeah.
Because even after you've done all that, even if you've built the relationships and you've seen kind of where everything is and you have a sense of where it needs to go next and you start laying that out, you're still going to get resistance.
Yeah.
You just are, because there's going to be something that, you know what, that was a great thing 10 years ago. But right now, we really need to cut that loose. But for those maybe 15 people that might be still connected to it, that's the best thing going in the church, right? And so, so you understand what I'm saying? So I think it's in those places where quick change isn't necessarily needing, or survival change is necessarily needed, and leaders come in and start just doing stuff because they feel like, for whatever reason, I mean, they need to make a name for themselves, or they just need to get their stamp. Everybody needs to see their stamp, who they are, what. I think that's where you run into real issues.
Yeah.
And
all that goes back to what you said earlier, knowing who you are. I feel like sometimes when we feel like we have to put our stamp on something, or a lot of anxiety in our job or in our role, we feel like we have to be doing something at all times. And if we're not careful, we'll be doing things that we don't perhaps even need or need to be doing. Jeff, anything you want to add in regards to the conversation?
What I keep hearing is this theme of, as you said, knowing yourself. And so I'm sitting here listening and thinking, if I'm out there listening to this podcast and you're saying know yourself, what does it mean as a leader to know yourself? And because I think in your answers, Dr. Walker, are all connected to that. The fact that if the predecessor or the person who is in leadership is still there, sitting on the church pew or at your organization, you could easily be threatened by that, especially if they've been successful. But what I'm hearing is, if you know your calling, you know who you are as a leader, you know how God has developed you for this moment in time, that will actually impact the way that you act or don't act as a leader in those positions.
Absolutely. That's exactly it. And knowing yourself, goodness gracious, how many episodes could we spend on talking about that, right?
A lot.
You understanding your strengths, understanding your weaknesses. What are your insecurities? It's interesting to me, and knowing your blind spots. Well, how can you know your blind spot if it's blind?
Yeah.
Right? So that's where you got to have the right people around you that you trust, that are going to tell you what you need to hear and not what you want. Recently had some feedback that surprised me. From some folks. There's some feedback that surprised me about my leadership, and I'm going, whoa, is that the way I come across? Is that? And so, yeah, I went to a couple of folks that know me well and are part of our organization. And I said, okay, I need you to tell me. I don't want you to tell me what you think I want to hear. I want you to tell me what I need to hear. Do I come across this way? Is this how people see me? Because I'm telling you, if it is, it's a blind spot to me.
Yeah.
I need to know. And so they were very honest and open about that. So that's the point I'm making. You have to understand all that about yourself. The whole idea of, self-awareness. I think that's so important. I'm not talking about self-aggrandizement. I'm not talking about self-centeredness. I'm not talking about where you've got to be the attention, but you need to have a good sense of how people view you.
Yeah.
When you're in a group of people, how are they seeing you? What dynamic do you bring? How do you contribute to the dynamic of a group? Patrick Lencioni, if you're familiar with that name, and he's written a lot of leadership books. Maybe you've got The Ideal Team Player. Boy, I would recommend that to any leader. It's a tremendous book. His books are simple in that he kind of tells a little story up front, and then he breaks down the model in the back. Mm-hmm. And so he talks about the ideal team player there's three components to an ideal team player: humble, hungry, and smart. You want to all three. And the humble, is that they are humble. They use the word we a lot. They talk about team a lot. They're quick to give others credit. The humble and sincerity, not false humility, but sincere. The hungry is the one that is the constant learner. They want to do their job with excellence. They're always looking for ways to improve and even to better the team. Smart is not the idea of just being intelligent. It's the idea of being group dynamic smart, the self-awareness, the understanding how you fit into a group. And so he said, those three components working together makes the ideal team player. And then he breaks those down. And if a person only has one of those, who they might be in, or two of those, or three of those. So the point I'm making there is I think that's for a leader, he or she has to have an understanding of how his or her team views them. And that's it. And I don't know that, I think that's kind of a work in progress, and as your team shifts, you've got to, and you got to be aware of your team and who they are as well. But that's the idea when I talk about the idea of knowing who you are, what triggers you, what triggers your insecurities.
Yeah.
How do you know when all of a sudden you're in that place, right? And so I think those are just good journeys to have as a person, and then as a leader as well. And maybe I shouldn't share this, but
go for it.
I'm going to go see my grandbaby, so everything's, I'm just out there. I struggle with performance-based acceptance.
Yeah.
And I have to know when I am operating out of that. I got to really understand that when I'm operating out of that within myself, because that leads to a whole lot of not very healthy behaviors. And really having a sense of, okay, you know where you are now, you know how to get back.
Yeah.
You know how to get out of there. And I think that's the idea. And having those types of understandings of yourself so that when you're there. For a long time, I didn't know I was there, but I was operating out of all that and just reaching to the discovery of that, and so that when you're there and you know how to get out of there. I think those types of things as you understand about yourself, so you're not letting that motivate all your actions and all your thinking, but just the opposite. You're able to work out of a more balanced, secure place.
That's good. That is so good, because what I hear you saying is, this is what we're talking about. This is a lifelong journey, isn't it?
Absolutely, I think. Yeah.
This is from when you start in ministry, from when you were a kid, all the way up to where you're at right now, has all been a learning experience. And that's just something we're constantly having to work on, because when you talk about change, that is difficult. And there's really no other way around it, is it?
No.
Whether you go in and it's quick and you're in a sinking ship and you have to make change immediately, or whether it can wait 6 months up to a year, when you make change, just go in there with a realistic expectation. It will be tough.
Yes.
And yeah.
I mentioned Sam Chan. He writes a book called Leadership Pain. And in that book, every chapter has a kind of a brief testimony or story from a leader and pain they faced in their leadership. And it's really all about the idea that if you're going to really be a leader, get ready for pain.
Wow.
And I'm paraphrasing this. I don't know if this is actually the way he says it. But basically, his premise is a leader is only effective to the threshold of their pain. Because not everybody's going to agree with you. Not everybody's just going to be touchy-feely. Mm-hmm. Yeah, if you're going to really be a successful leader, you got to prepare yourself for pain. And I think you can go throughout the Bible from Genesis to Revelation. Look at every leader that's ever existed in terms of the biblical history and accomplished. They all went through some kind of pain. And it's just a part of it. And I think that's why in some respects they said leadership is not for the faint of heart. And, some leaders are summoned, some leaders are made, and some leaders are born. And maybe there's a combination of all that in all leaders. But, when you find yourself there, just know, and what makes the pain worth it is the success. And when I say success, I don't necessarily mean big dollars or big buildings or huge, if it's a pastor, huge crowds. Obviously, those can certainly be a part of the success. But the idea of accomplishing the mission, vision God had for you and the people that you are leading, that He's entrusted, that you've accomplished that. That's where you got it. The audience of one. Mm-hmm. The audience of one. It's and then I'm doing it for Him. And that but the more that becomes the primary motivation of what you're doing, oh, wow, that solves that covers a multitude, right? It solves a multitude of issues. And that doesn't mean it's going to be easy. That doesn't mean it's going to be pain-free. It doesn't. I mean, you just look at Jesus Christ. I mean, He followed the audience of one, and look where it took Him. Now, I'm not saying we all got to go be martyrs,
right?
And I'm not talking about take on the messianic complex,
right?
But the reality is, what. In my humble opinion, if I'm going and accomplishing what God's called of me with this group of people He's entrusted to me, and together we're working for this common vision for the Lord, whatever big, small, in between, boy, we get there. That's the greatest success.
Wow.
But it may take some pain to get there.
Well, let's. It's interesting that you say that about pain, because right now in our culture, we're avoiding pain. All right. In fact, pain is considered to be not only unpleasant as it is for everyone, but it's considered an indicator that something is wrong. Maybe I've done something wrong. Maybe I'm in the wrong position. Maybe I'm going in the wrong direction. And we are focused on avoiding all pain and discomfort. And yet you're saying, well, as a leader, you're going to feel pain. You're going to feel discomfort. And it doesn't necessarily indicate that you're doing anything wrong. Maybe you're doing something right, actually, and you're feeling the pain, right?
Yeah, exactly right. I mean, it's, just think about it. I mean, an athlete preparing to be the best athlete possible, what does he or she have to do? Exercise. Mm-hmm. Exercise is painful. Yes. That's a good pain.
Yes.
I mean,
yes.
So yes, I mean, it is, leaders deal with sleepless nights, because they're wrestling with something and they got to walk through those types of things. I'm not talking about, if you have 15 sleepless nights in a row, that's not healthy. But the idea is leaders wrestle with things that other folks may not be wrestling with. And leaders have to recognize this is a part of this, but it's for a season. It's not for the lifetime of leadership. It's for a season. It's a preparatory time, or it's in the middle of a crisis type of situation. My dad, he talked about this idea of, it goes in seasons and cycles. And you're going to have those seasons of leadership, man, that it's intense. And you got to realize that, but you're going to come out the other side. And when you come out the other side, find the sabbatical, find the Sabbath, find the rest time, recuperate. Does that make sense what I'm saying?
Absolutely.
And I think too, I tell you, when I first came to Lee, and Dr. Sargent can testify to this, he was a chair of a department for for a lot longer time than I was. But I came in, one of my responsibilities was being a chair of department. Now I'm stepping right out of the pulpit, right? I got all the church rhythms. I know how the church world operates in the rhythms. Man, I was just learning the higher ed rhythm. Oh my goodness. The spring semester is ridiculous in the higher ed, especially after spring break. And my first year sitting in that chair position, that first spring break, it literally ran over me.
Oh, wow.
Because there's so many responsibilities that you have to do in that spring semester of wrapping up things. And there's just so much at that administrative level, especially at the chair level. The point being that the next year, I was better prepared. I had to kind of get run over, to learn, and I realized, I'm not in Kansas anymore, Toto. There's a whole different rhythm here. There's a whole different way that this is done. And sometimes the only way you can learn is trial and error, failing, whatever. Failing, people that fail aren't failures.
Yeah.
People that are failures are really those that quit. They give up. They don't keep pressing. The whole
Exactly.
idea of grit, the whole idea of learning, the whole idea of picking yourself up and moving forward. Boy, if the gospel's anything, it's that. The gospel is, we're a group of failures.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
absolutely.
That by the grace of God has given us the ability to get up and move forward.
Right.
So.
Excellent. And we shouldn't feel bad about being a human being, like you said. I mean, that's part of it. And we often learn, I've learned this in my short journey, that through my failures is when my greatest moments of learning has taken place. And so let that shape you, mold you. Now, I appreciate your openness and candidness, Dr. Walker. I want to ask you, because you did mention about going to see your granddaughter soon.
Yeah.
And this will be the first time that you've been able to hold her, correct?
Yeah.
And been born now for 3 weeks.
Uh-huh.
One of the questions I want to ask you is, how do you kind of manage your work, your position as a leadership, and your family? How do you have healthy boundaries? Because that is something that we see quite often here at Ministerial Care, is that struggle. Because ministry is so demanding. There's always something that needs to be done, an email that needs to be responded to, a sermon that needs to be preached, and there's always something coming at us. How do you manage that healthy boundary between your work life, your ministry as a leader, and your family?
Yeah, I wish I could sit here and tell you, boy, I do that really, really well, but I don't. However, I have a wife that really helps me be sure I do that. Maybe we could get me in a therapy room and talk about codependency or something. I don't know.
For another day.
For another day, right?
For another day.
And I will be standing here being the answer man, if you will. You guys can analyze me. But yeah, I don't do it well, unfortunately. My wife is very huge in helping me to help keep that balance. If you're familiar with the Strength Finder test, if you're familiar with that. Okay. Yes. My number one strength, achiever.
Yes.
And if you go read through, that, it'll tell you a lot.
Right.
So yeah, and seriously, she does help me to do that. But I do try to really protect my Sundays, for one thing, And that was a huge transition. I was a pastor for 33 years. Sundays were a work day. Mm-hmm. Then I shift over here to. It was really a strange transition.
I bet.
But I do try to protect my Sabbaths. I do try to have, you used the word quiet time. I do try to protect those. I'm an early riser. Mm-hmm. And no matter how late I go to bed, I'm an early riser. And so I try to use that initial time. It's my best thinking time. I'm just more aware. I do try to use that time the best I can. I don't do it every day. To just really spend time with the Lord, whether that's just sitting in meditation. I usually have a Bible reading plan every year that I just walk through and incorporating that. I'm not a big journaler. Mm-hmm. I journal. I'm a binge journaler. It's weird. I get in a place where I just kind of I just want to write down thoughts. Mm-hmm. And I may do that for a season, but then may not go to it. One of the things that journaling helps for me is when I'm really wrestling with something in my life. Maybe I'm wrestling with a motive. Am I doing this for the right reason? where I'm wrestling with, why am I feeling this sense of discontentment or something? And then I just start writing. I just start writing free thoughts, just not trying to censor myself and just write. Mm-hmm. And what that's done for me is it's helped me finally get through kind of maybe all the minutia and maybe eventually get down to what it is. That's just a technique that has helped me. I don't do that all the time. It's just when I'm in those places. But I do try, and I love family, and I do try to really block out family time. People ask me, what are your hobbies? My family. I love being with my family. We love getting with our kids and our grandkids. And that's another thing my wife has really kept as something very, very important to us. And it's something my parents that I grew up with modeled. We really try to really take time for family. And one thing, boy, I really learned from my dad in that whole thing. My dad was, he pastored a huge church and was in demand for a lot of things. But my dad always showed up at my brother's ball games. Mm-hmm. I can't think of a time when we played from the time we were little bitty guys all the way through high school. He wasn't up there. He wasn't up there in those stands. And my dad was not a passive fan. My dad was a pretty
big fan.
Oh yeah, so you knew when he was up there.
Yeah.
You knew when he was up there. Just learned. And my dad also taught me something. I haven't done it as well as him, and I hope to get better at it. But he would talk about, and I'd hear him talking at all kind of leadership conferences or whatever. He talked about taking mini vacations, M-I-N-I, not M-A-N-Y, but M-I-N-I, where you take a long weekend. He would try to schedule those out. Where you're taking that time off, you're building it in, and that was a huge part too that we try to do, schedule that time. Mm-hmm. And that's what he did a lot of that I learned from too. He would schedule those times in.
I love it.
I feel like I'm kind of all over the map there, but those are some things I try. But yeah, just being gut level honest is something I got to get better at myself.
Yeah, and I appreciate you being honest about that, because I do feel like that's something that a lot of us are trying to constantly just balance and trying to figure that out ourselves.
Yeah.
And I love the idea of mini vacations and just the concept of that. And resting, one of the things I feel like God has created us to go at camel speed, and we're trying to go as though we're supersonic jets. Dr. Walker, I want to say thank you so much for being with us today.
My pleasure.
I mean, it has been so enriching. I know that our listeners are going to enjoy listening to this. And who better? Let's be honest, who better to talk to about transitional leadership and what you've had to kind of really walk into there at Lee, going through a pandemic. Dr. Kahn, I can't say enough about him as well. And it's so refreshing to hear your perspective and your expertise. So thank you for being with us. Is there anything you want to add, anything you want to say out there to our pastors, our leaders out there at the Church of God before you leave today?
Just keep leading. Just keep going. God has you there. He's got you there for the intended purpose. Keep leaning into that.
Yeah.
Don't be afraid to be who you are. Don't be afraid to lead how God's equipped you to lead, called you to lead. As long as you're honoring Him, moving forward, you can't do any better than that.
Amen. God does not make mistakes.
No, He doesn't.
And if He's called you to do if He's called you to serve where you're at, there's a reason. And so trust that calling that God has had for us. Dr. Walker, thank you once again for being with us. It's an honor. Let's get into the section of our show where we talk about action steps. And I think there's a few things that we can draw from this. First and foremost, I think it's really important that we be secure in who we are. It is really, really, really important to know the calling that God has for you in your life and be confident, not cocky, but be confident in what God has for you. You do not have to try to replicate someone else. And that brings me to my second point. Don't try to be someone that you're not. If you are not funny, if that is not your gift, probably don't want to have that in your sermons too often. Make sure you know who you are. Be confident in that. You have strengths and abilities that God has given to you to use, and you don't have to do everything. That's not what God's called you to do, but be confident in who you are and do not try to replicate someone else. And you don't feel like you always have to replicate the past as well. And also, number 3, change is always situational. What I mean by that is sometimes, from what Dr. Walker was sharing, change needs to come pretty quickly whenever you are going through transition, especially if you feel like you're on a sinking ship and it requires right now. The worst thing you can do when you need action is inaction. But also there are times when it's not a sinking ship and there's more of a smooth process between that transition, and change can come along much slower, and it allows you time to develop relationships, get to know your community, and get to know the surrounding area around you. So change is definitely situational on how quick or how soon you should do that. And then number 4, I think this is probably the more revealing one to me, is that pain is to be expected in leadership and specifically to change. There's no way around it. You are going to be uncomfortable. You're going to experience pain. It's not an indictment on your calling. It's not an indictment on who you are in Christ. It is just part of the process. Know that it is difficult. And I don't know anyone who has gone through change in their life, or whether it be personal or professional, where it was not uncomfortable to some extent. Pain is not an indication you are failing. It could be an indication that you are very much finding success. That is part of it. So know that going into it with realistic expectations. That finishes up our action points today. That brings us to the final segment of our show called Mailbag. And so, Jeff, if you would, please give us a question from the mailbag today for us to answer.
Hi, Tim. This particular question we've seen more than once, and it basically centers around the idea of confidentiality. All right, so I believe that I need to seek the services of the Office of Ministerial Care, and I'm willing to come to Cleveland. And I think I trust the counselors there. But knowing that I'm in Cleveland and knowing that I'm a minister in the Church of God, how can I be confident? Can you help me be more confident in the confidentiality, and that this won't be reported to my bishop or whoever else, my supervisor, etc.?
I'm glad you asked that question, and our viewer asked that question. You can rest assured we are very professional here at Ministerial Care. And trust is paramount to our success. We have to be able, it's up to us, it is our job to enable trust and to establish trust. And we are 100% confidential in what we do. And so what does that mean exactly? Higher ups do not know that you will be coming to our, using our services. They will not even know that you've called us. I have been here now for over 10 years, and not once has anyone over me in the Lord, anyone across the street, has ever asked me who we're counseling, what we're counseling about. That is 100% up to us in the counseling office and God. So the only people that know that you're coming in are myself and the people who work here full time, and they're bound by that confidentiality. I'm very proud of this. I think this would get back to me if it was out there, but I cannot think of one instance where that confidentiality was broken. And as I said, I've been here now a decade. And so we want you to feel safe and secure, knowing that if you come to us and you need help, and maybe you just need another set of eyes, right, to help you along your journey, that whenever you do come to us, it is going to be in confidentiality. We even have the door that you come into is the back door here. And because we do everything we can to try to protect that as best as we can. So once again, Dr. Manis here. Thank you for joining us on Pastoring on Purpose. Be sure to follow us on Facebook. You can find us at facebook.com/COGCMC. We're also on Twitter at Twitter. We're at Twitter, listen to me, at COGCMC. You can check out my own Twitter handle at Praying Manis. We look forward to seeing you next time on Pastoring on Purpose. God bless.